Now this morning we come to the last in our series for January, looking at the big picture of the Bible. Thus far, we've covered the beginning, creation, and we saw that God made an amazing universe, an amazing earth, and amazing humanity, and his verdict over all of that was that it was very good. And so God's intention towards us has been so positive, so good. Then Steve Early brought a message that showed the disaster that occurred, where human beings rebelled against God, disobeyed God, and they lost that pristine garden environment that they'd been gifted with, and they lost that immediate fellowship with God. But there was a promise in the midst of that tragedy that something would be done about it, that God would actually intervene. And last week, if you're here in the morning, you would have heard Timon speak on that intervention. God in Christ providing redemption, providing a solution to our rebellion against God, to restore us back to God. And that was in the midst of having a baptismal service, which sadly I missed because my oldest son Daniel got married. But awesome news that God is still on our side, still working for our good. And this morning we come to our last in this series. Now, I know it's not considered to be good practice to skip to the end of a book without reading everything in between. Some of you like to cheat, and find out what the ending of the story is before you've read all the parts. But we're going to have to do that today because with 4 weeks, you can only really start with the first chapter, the second chapter, some chapter in the middle, and then you get to the very last chapter. So if you have a Bible with you, if you don't, there's one in the shelf in the seat in front of you. Turn to the book of Revelation in chapter 21, which is on page 1041 if you're using the Pew Bible. And we're going to look at the picture that John received from God about what the future of this universe, the future of this world, and the future of humanity is really going to be like. Now, it's no accident that the beginning and ending of this story are actually parallel to each other. Some have talked about the loss of the beginning as paradise lost, and the recovery of that as paradise regained. I do want to say right up front that often we have misconceptions about what the future will hold. Some of those misconceptions relate to the idea of heaven, that our future existence outside of this life and in the resurrection of a new life is going to be heaven. And a lot of people think, well, heaven's a bit hard to relate to because after all, how tangible is heaven? How substantial is heaven? Many misconceptions about, floating around in fluffy clouds, playing harps and all of that stuff that exists in our culture. What we're going to see in this particular section of the book of Revelation is that our future is substantial, concrete. In fact, it's more concrete and more substantial than the present reality that we are actually living. So the beginning began with God created the heavens and the earth. And then in this new environment of the future, we read in Revelation 21 verse 1, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more." And if you read later in this section of the book of Revelation, you get down to verse 5, it says, "And he who was seated on the throne said, 'Behold, I am making all things new.'" In fact, that's the theme of chapters 21 and 22 of the book of Revelation. It's the theme of newness. Old is gone, new has come. And it's actually a very strong biblical theme. Even right now, God says that old has gone and new has come for those who are Christians. We're new creations because of the work of Christ and the gospel. But I like new things. I think most of us like new things. And new clothes, new house, new car. The smell of a new car, isn't it great? You open that door and you go in there, new car. And then after a few months, it's, old car. New things are great, but new things don't last. They grow old. We also don't mind new experiences. It's another thing that we really seek often, and many people actually drive their lives on the basis of a new experience, another new experience, another new experience. Whether it's food, gourmet meal, trying out a new menu, or whether it's travel, going to exotic destinations. And Elizabeth, my wife, and I, we love to travel. There's a couple of places in the world that we haven't yet been, just a few. And we've got plans, God willing, to maybe see and visit and experience some of those places. Who knows? But again, those experiences fade. They don't last. And we all seem to have another one, a new one. And as you get older, they fade faster. That's just the way it is. So it's not like the world can't offer you something new. The world does offer these new things and these new experiences. But the problem with the world is that it's a passing away world. The new doesn't last. The new becomes old. And Ecclesiastes says it kind of like this. In Ecclesiastes 1:9, it says, there's nothing new under the sun. When that philosophical writing was penned by Solomon, he was looking at life in general and life's experiences and life's purpose and so on. And he basically boiled life down to saying, well, every single human being basically has the same stuff. There's nothing really new under the sun. You see, the one problem we have is lasting newness is impossible to find in our passing world. But I've got good news. God can provide permanent newness now and in the future. The Bible does describe that not only is the world passing, but it's a world in need of transformation. Romans chapter 8, it tells us that this creation is a groaning creation. It's subject to futility. It's subject to death, to decay, to corruption. We see it all around us. It used to be a joke about, cars that you could tell that they were corrupting because they rusted. You get that old rust in the tailgate, the rust in the fenders. Rust is sort of a testimony to the fact that this world is not the way it should be. It's a broken world. But the good news is that God has a plan for this world, a plan for this universe, and a plan for us as human beings, which involves something much better than the way it is now, something entirely new. So let me read for you these few verses at the beginning of the book of Revelation, beginning of chapter 21 of the book of Revelation. I saw a new heaven, a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will be with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more, neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. This short section of the book of Revelation, the closing part of the book of Revelation, has 4 new realities that provide hope and inspire faithfulness. 4 new realities that provide hope, and this world needs that desperately, and inspires faithfulness, which we need desperately. So what are these 4 new realities that John reveals to us as he receives this vision of the future? The first one is a new cosmos, an entirely new order of things throughout this universe, a new heaven and a new earth. Now, it's not surprising he says that right at this point, because if you read the book of Revelation, you'll find that chapter 19 is kind of the culminating judgments of God on the enemies of God, that is then followed by an amazing time of Christ's reign on earth, which then culminates on the final judgment of humanity, including Satan himself. So God has dealt with all that has been the cause of all our problems. Way back in the garden story that we learned about earlier in our series, sin had entered the universe and messed things up terribly through Satan and then through the rebellion of Adam and Eve. And God had made a promise then. He'd said to the first human beings, Adam and Eve, that there would come a day when the seed of the woman, who would be Christ, would crush the head of the serpent, who was actually Satan. That day has come. That day has already arrived. Jesus has already come. The cross is a past event. But the effects of that have not yet been fully realized. The beauty is that personally we can experience that promise, but there's yet a time to come when everything's going to be dealt with, particularly Satan and all of that which he has brought upon us. And so that has happened in this future story. So as John is telling the story of this universe, as he's relaying what God is doing in the future, he's already dealt with Satan and sin. And so now we have this new heaven and this new earth. And interestingly, it says that there's no sea in this new earth, this new world. Now, for some of you, you're going, hang on a minute. What about fishing? What about going out in the boat? What about cruising? Don't we like cruising? What about those things that we enjoy now? Well, I don't want to really get into what that side of things will mean in the future because I don't think we have much information on it. But if you read biblically, the concept of sea is related to the idea of the disruption of sin. The chaos, the constant churning of the ocean, the restlessness of the wicked, that's all associated with the imagery of the ocean and the sea. So I think what John is saying here by his vision is that that's all done with. That doesn't exist anymore. That has been taken care of. So the dominant presence of the seas or the oceans is changed. And there's a concrete testimony to the removal of all the disturbances that sin produces. And so the big picture is a new heaven, a new earth. That's the larger scene. John now zooms in a bit and zooms in on a city. In verse 2 he says, "And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband." As he zooms in on this new city, it seems that this city is already in existence. It's already there. It just hasn't yet been connected to the earth ourselves. And so it probably, I think, is a reference to what Jesus had promised his own disciples back in John chapter 14, when he said to them, "I'm going to prepare a place for you. And once I've done what I need to do, I'm going to come back and get you guys so that you can be with me." And I think this is the place. This place is a city. And the significant thing about this city is its newness. In contrast with the historical, traditional Jerusalem, this is the new Jerusalem, a new place for God's people. As you may recall, if you know your Old Testament history, Jerusalem was the chosen capital of God's people. Jerusalem was the place of the temple. Jerusalem was a place where God's name was placed and God's presence was known. And so that old is going and a new is coming, the new Jerusalem, which has got permanence. And as we read it further, and we don't have time to read every verse here in the book of Revelation, but I encourage you to read the whole section, 21 and 22. But we do find a little bit later down in this chapter a greater description of this heavenly New Jerusalem. It's, first of all, we've seen that its splendor is amazing. Its beauty is spectacular because it's a bride prepared for her wedding. As I mentioned earlier, last weekend Elizabeth and I were away because Daniel, our son, our oldest boy, got married to Jade. And really, a woman is very rarely more beautiful than she is on her wedding day because everything is so set up for that relationship. And for some cases, everything's been kept secret. I mean, nobody knows what the dress looks like apart from the ladies, and the man's waiting to see his bride appear at the end of whatever corridor they've developed for her to walk down. And then when that first image is seen, it's like, whoa. And it was for Daniel, and it was for us. I mean, Jade was absolutely spectacular. She looked so beautiful. And that's the kind of correlation that John's trying to get across to us, that there's nothing more beautiful, nothing more spectacular than the picture of this city. But it's not only like a bride prepared for a wedding, it's a city where the glory of God dwells, in verse 11. It's a city that's magnificent in scale. I mean, the dimensions that are given here are enormous dimensions. I mean, we might talk about, the CBD of Adelaide being a mile square. This city is 1,500 miles square in its dimensions. It's spectacular in beauty. It's magnificent in scale. And then it's made of the most precious materials. The streets are gold. I mean, so if you want to really take stuff to heaven, it's a waste. I mean, goodness me, they pave the streets with gold. All of the materials are precious stones, including pearls. And so it's made of the best quality, the most beautiful, the most precious substances. And not only that, but God's glory provides the light of this city. And so this city doesn't have any night. You know, there are cities in the world, even our own city, where you really don't want to be in the dark. You don't want to be in an alleyway without light because it's dangerous. It could be life-threatening. In fact, you could even die. Those kind of cities are not secure places. They're not places that you really want to be. This city is permanent light. There's no darkness in this city. And not only that, the gates of this city are always open. So everything about this city is beautiful, spectacular. In fact, it's perfect. And it's, guess what? Our destiny. If we belong to God, this is our future home. And it's not an unearthly city. It's not sort of some kind of mystical, ethereal, transparent kind of ghost-like environment. This is actually a tangible reality that will be connected to this tangible earth, but it'll be a new heavens, a new earth, and a new Jerusalem. And so this is related to God in a general sense, but there's more, because John goes on to tell us not only about a new cosmos and a new city, but a new closeness. In verse 3, we read again, "And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God.'" I do think that in romance, in love relationships, one of the toughest things, or the most difficult thing to deal with, is separation. Being apart. I think Gavin and Lorianne can testify to that reality. They've had a pretty difficult year last year, being apart so often because of their circumstances. You know, closeness with your loved one is the desirable circumstance you want. You want to be beside them. You want to be near them. You want to be experiencing all these things together. And the reality was, we learned from Steve early that sin separated us from God. Sin interrupted that relationship that Adam and Eve had known with God. When they walked with God in the garden, then they hid from God and God had to find them. They didn't have that intimacy of relationship anymore. But the good news is, and we've celebrated in communion today, that Jesus has brought us near to God. His blood has paid the price that we deserve to pay. His death has paid for our sin, and therefore we've been brought near to God. And so for Christians, we have this renewed intimacy with God. We have this new presence of God in our lives. We're actually called temples of God, and the church is called a temple as a community. But you know, there are many times in our lives when God doesn't seem very near. And not because we've necessarily been, sinful and deliberately disobedient and going on our own way, but just because the presence of God is not the same tangible reality as, say, sitting next to Andrew or sitting next to your wife or whatever. There's a spiritual reality that's there, but it's not always clearly perceived. It sometimes feels like God's a million miles away, even though we know the truth is he's present. And that's part of living in this earth at this time with ourselves and including our fallenness. But something new is on the way. God has plans that will not be our continuing experience. God intends that one day we will see him face to face. We will know intimacy in his presence beyond what we've currently experienced. There'll be no hindrance, no interruption, nothing that will distract. Because the message here is very emphatic. John doesn't see something at this point. He actually hears it, but he hears it with a loud voice from heaven. Not a whisper, a loud voice from heaven, which communicates an emphatic message. And then it starts with the word behold, which means look up, pay attention, this is important. And then the message is so singular because 3 times the voice says that God will be with his people and mentions that God's presence or abode will be with them and his dwelling will be among them. So you get the message here that God is really keen for us to enjoy his presence without any kind of limitation or hindrance. Things are getting much more personal. This is a relational reality. Later in the book of Revelation, John will say that there'll be no more curse, but the throne of God and the Lamb shall be in it, and his servants shall serve him. They shall see his face. His name shall be on their foreheads. This is that connection. He also says there's no temple in the city, for the temple is the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb. And as I mentioned, the gates of the city are never closed. And so access to God is immediate. It's not through rituals. It's not through intermediate means. It's immediate in his presence, and it's continuous, uninterrupted. So really, heaven is God. God is heaven. That's why actually this is a touch of heaven right here. You know, the gathering of God's people on a Sunday is actually an experience, a foretaste of heaven in a very limited sense, because I guarantee you heaven's much better. The people are much improved because we're all perfect in heaven. But it is the reality of God's presence. So I have to ask myself the question, and yourself the question, what are you looking forward to in heaven? You know, do you want the ocean so you can go the fishing and do the cruising? Or do you want Jesus? You know, do you really want the presence of God? Because that's what heaven is really all about. And it's in the pleasure of his presence that we are fully satisfied. It's in the pleasure of his presence that we actually enjoy our full humanity. It's in the pleasure of his presence that we actually experience joy. That's why we can have it now to a degree, but then to an ultimate experience. You see, it's going to be better than Adam and Eve. You know, Adam and Eve enjoyed the presence of God. They walked with God in the cool of the evening. I love that picture. It's just such a nice, warm, intimate picture to walk with someone, especially God, in a cool of an evening, in a garden environment, no dramas, no threats, everything is good, but it was lost. And God is going to restore it, but it's going to be better. You know why it's going to be better? Well, one, because you can't lose it. So it's permanent, it's eternal. But the other reason it's better is because it's deepened. It's deepened by the work of redemption. It's deepened by the reality that not only were we loved originally in our unfallen state, in our perfect state, but we've been loved regardless. And that love has brought us to a place of fellowship with the God who made us. And that's much better because we enjoy, and I think Steve pointed that out beautifully with his discussion of sin, that it's actually good for us to recognize how much more we are loved by God because he loves us still, even in our rebellion. So how much better it is. It's a bit like making up with your wife after you've had a little bit of a tiff. You know, it's a really great experience to actually reconnect that relationship. This is a reconnection of a relationship that's eternal, to be enjoyed forever. And not only is this a new cosmos and a new city and a new closeness, but it's also in a new condition, a totally different situation from right now. One of the realities of the Bible is that when God is present, things change. God's presence is never passive. It's always active. It's always accomplishing something. And in this case, God changes things and people. Significant changes from the present situation. Because that which messes this world up, that which is part of a broken world, is entirely removed. This is very personal, I think, to everybody here, because none of us in this room are going to be exempt from what is described here. Look what John says. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. I don't think there's a person in this building that will go through life without tears. And I mean tears of sorrow. I mean, we can have tears of gladness, but we can have tears of sorrow. You know, our church has been touched by sorrow in recent times. Our city has been touched by sorrow. I mean, Stewie Beveridge is down here as a part of Samaritans Perth to help the people who were affected by the bushfire just recently. You know, the city has been touched by, our nation has been touched by sorrow. Our world is, I mean, you just turn the news on And every time you hear the news, you're going to hear a story of pain, suffering, sorrow, tears. Tears, I think, are included here, just like see earlier, because it's very tangible. You know, crying is the expression of sorrow. Tears are the expression of sorrow. And God says that he will do what? Wipe away every tear. Not just some of the tears, not just a large amount of the tears, he's going to wipe away every tear. Which basically means everything that's associated with this fallen world, this broken world, the sorrow, the pain, the anguish that goes with this world is no longer going to be the experience of the new earth. And if you're in that new earth, it won't be your experience either. Death, sorrow, crying, pain have invaded this world because of our own rebellion against God. And their removal is a powerful indication that that curse is gone. That curse is finished. That curse has ended. Satan's promised defeat has occurred, and now it has been completely initiated and finalized. All is now, well, all will be, should I say, as it should have been, but it's better. It's more so. This city in chapter 22 is described as having the river of the water of life. So there is still water, guys. You know, so if you're into water skiing, no. There is still water there. And it will also have the tree of life. And both these symbols were back in Genesis, chapters 1 and 2. When it described the Garden of Eden, the tree of life was in the midst of the garden. When it described the rivers that flowed from the Garden of Eden and replenished the earth, again, these are images of life, abundance, provision that God has made. And they're much better because they're eternal in nature. They cannot be lost. So as we think about this eternal home, we think about this new heavens, this new earth, the new cosmos, the new city, the new closeness to God and the new condition, what should our response be? You know, what difference does it make to God's people? Have you ever heard the statement, you know, this guy's so heavenly minded, he's no earthly use? You ever heard that statement? It used to fly around Christian circles a lot. It's actually quite theologically wrong. Because the more heavenly minded you are, the genuinely heavenly mindedness, the greater earthly use you have, by a long shot. But I think there are two important, not only responses, but encouragements from this reality, this future reality. The first one is that it gives hope. And the second one is it inspires faithfulness. You know, everybody needs hope. We can't really live without it. Someone has said that you can live without food for about 70 days. I can't imagine that myself. 70 hours maybe, but 70 days. Whew. Suggests you can actually live without water for about 10 days. I guess it presumes that you're in really good health when you start. Because after all, if you're not too good at the beginning, I'm sure you'd fade sooner. They reckon you can also live up to 6 minutes without air. I find that hard to believe. When I go underwater, I come up after 30 seconds. But, you know, they went on to say it's impossible to live without hope. Suicide is a problem in our culture, Western society. And even amongst young people, of all people who seem to have everything before them. And the reason it happens is people lose hope. They don't see any reason to live. They don't see any purpose. They don't see any future. They have no hope. So why go on with the pain? Why go on with the boredom? Why go on with whatever? Have no hope. But if you know what your future is, and this future is secure, this future is guaranteed, this future is amazing, then surely we have hope. You know, Paul, the apostle, knew suffering, knew pain, knew difficulty in his life as he served Christ. But these are some of the things he wrote. In Romans 8, verse 18, he said, I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that's to be revealed to us. He also wrote this, for momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison. I mean, I love Paul's understatement. Momentary light affliction. You know, he gets stoned to death. He's shipwrecked 3 times. He's in the deep. He's under threat from enemies, robbers on the way in which he travels. And on top of that, he's got enemies within the church who'd like to get rid of him as well. And he's carrying the burden of all the churches because of the great passion he has for their well-being. And he's got a momentary light affliction. It kind of makes us look pretty soft, doesn't it? I mean, but the reality is it's comparative. Compared with the experience of this earth, as hard and as difficult as it might be, and then for some it's actually death, when you look at the prospect of eternity, the new heavens and the new earth, all that God promises, it's a momentary light affliction. But you know what it requires of us? We need to believe that's our future. And we need to dwell regularly on that future. Because our minds can be so earthly bound that they're of no heavenly use. That is the problem. The hope that we have counters the despair and the anxiety and the pain and the suffering that we are going to experience in this earth. It'll happen. Even if we've got a good life in Australia, which most of us do, it's a pretty well protected country at the moment, but we still are not exempt from pain, and we're not exempt from suffering, and we're not exempt from even the attacks of the enemy. You see, Paul not only had hope and certain hope, and therefore he could compare well with his present experience, he also found that this made him faithful. It kept him on the task. It enabled him to remain faithful. Because why wouldn't you be faithful when you have such a future before you from a God who loves you so deeply and is committed to you entirely? I mean, God's put it all on the line. He gave his son. So there's no way that he's not going to go all the way to the end. And we are part of that. It's just so remarkable. Paul did not lose heart, and that strengthened him to be faithful. The US Marines are pretty well known for this kind of commitment to duty. And there's a story from their own. Back in 1983, there was a bombing in Beirut, attacked where the Marines were staying in a hotel. And one of the Marines was critically injured in this explosion. Sadly, many of his buddies had been killed in this attack. He was in hospital. He's covered with bandages. He had a jungle of tubes attached to his body, and he couldn't speak. And as would be typical, his commander-in-chief visits his troops, his soldiers, and General Paul Kelly visited this particular Marine. And when he did, the Marine wanted to write something. He wanted to communicate. And so, painfully, he wrote these words, 2 words, Semper Fi. And that's a shortened version of the US Marine Corps motto, Semper Fidelis, which means always faithful. I think that's very challenging. If the US Marines can have a motto that says always faithful, then I think God's Marines should at least adopt that motto. We should be faithful because God has been faithful to us. But I guess the challenge is, are we? And our faithfulness is energized. Our faithfulness is actually strengthened through hope. And hope comes because of future. A hope that's realized is no longer hope. The hope we have now is still future. But it's as certain as your current breathing air is. It's as certain as you sitting in these seats is. It is no less real than what you currently experience. In fact, it's far more real because it's going to be the replacement of everything. As I said in the first message this morning, God is in the renovation business. He's not in the wrecking business. There are some people who like to just demolish things and start again. God actually likes to take what exists and make it new. And he's taken our lives that exist and he's made them new. And he's going to take this earth, this universe as it exists, and he's going to make it new, and it's going to be our home forever. I'm looking forward to that day. I hope you are. Let's pray.